And I wanted to once again welcome you to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program's Homeowner Webinar Series. My name is Claire Lewis, and I am the Florida Friendly Community Statewide Coordinator. Today we have Dr. Rachel Mallinger speaking about planting for bees. Your microphones have been muted, you may have noticed. So if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box and we'll answer them at the end of this presentation. And please stick around until the end of the presentation to take the survey. It helps us give you the kind of programming that you like and lets us know how we're doing. Dr. Mallinger is an assistant professor in the Department of Entomology and Nematology at the University of Florida. She's a pollinator ecologist focusing her research primarily on native wild bees. And she teaches courses on pollinator ecology and conservation. She received her BA in biology from Kalamazoo College in Michigan and a master's and PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research interests include community ecology of pollinators, pollination biology of crops and wild plants, and landscape ecology. She conducts research in a variety of ecosystems, including natural, agricultural, and urban, with the overarching goal of informing pollinator conservation and improving pollination services. And with that, I will go ahead and turn the microphone and the screen over to Dr. Mallinger.
All right, thank you, Claire. Before I get started, there was a comment in the Q&A about the screen share. I don't know, since your mics are turned off, maybe someone could just type in the chat. Do you see the full power? You should see a slide that says gardening for bees. Hopefully you all see that. Maybe okay, I see yes. Okay.
It shows up fine.
Okay, great. All right, looks good. All right, then we will get started. And I see, I won't share your responses, all the responses, but I see some great plants in the chat, many of which we'll talk about today. Some of these are great bee plants. Some of them are great plants for butterflies and hummingbirds as well. And so I'll bring up a lot of the plants that you've mentioned. I see firebush, salvia, gaillardia, sunflower, including beach sunflower, pentas, zinnias, mountain mint. So we'll touch on a lot of those. It's great to see your responses. Okay, so today I'm going to briefly chat about why garden for bees and other pollinators. Why are they important? And then I'll move into, in general, what bees need and how you can provide those needs for bees through gardening, primarily focusing on the plants that you can select for bees. Some of these plants will also be good for other pollinators, and I'll talk a little bit about what makes a plant particularly good for bees, because that's going to be the focus today. And then we'll end by just touching on other things that you can do for bees and other pollinators. So first of all, why garden for bees and pollinators more broadly? I think it's important to understand what pollination is, because we talk a lot about pollinators, and pollinators are important because they perform this service of pollination. And plants can reproduce in a variety of ways. They can clone themselves through things like runners and buds and tubers. But it's really important for many plants to reproduce sexually, to create little baby plants that are different from the parents. And that helps with genetic diversity and biodiversity more broadly. And so pollination is part of the sexual reproduction process. Pollination enables plants to reproduce sexually, to create little baby plants that are genetically distinct. And essentially what it is it's the movement of pollen from the anthers, which look like the little strings or little stems with the round little ball at the top. That's the anther there. And pollination is the movement from that anther to the stigma, where the end of the arrow is. And this can happen within a flower. So you can have that movement just within a flower, or you can have it between flowers on the same plant or between flowers on different plants. And when that happens successfully, you not only get plant reproduction, but you also get seeds and fruits that many other animals, including humans, eat. The plants that produce pollen include the gymnosperms, the conifers and cycads, that second group on the top of the tree, as well as the angiosperms or flowering plants. And the angiosperms or flowering plants are the ones that are primarily pollinated by animals. meaning animals need to do the work of moving that pollen from the anther to the stigma. The gymnosperms make pollen, they're pollen producing plants, but they're primarily wind pollinated. So they'll be pollinated mostly through a wind. They don't rely on animals. And so when we talk about pollination, we're talking about the flowering plants or the angiosperms. And these are going to be the same plants that you want to select for pollinators when you're gardening. So conifers, as well as the plants lower down on that tree, ferns, mosses, those are not going to be animal pollinated, and they're not going to provide resources for pollinators. The plants that are animal pollinated, including those flowering angiosperm plants, tend to produce showy rewards and have showy flowers. So they'll have big, bright, colorful flowers, and they produce nectar as a reward to attract pollinators. So you can see that picture there on the far right. That's kind of a classic animal pollinated plant. It has a bright, showy flower. It's going to produce nectar. And then ones that are plants that are wind or water pollinated, like the ones to the left of that, are not going to have those showy flowers. So that's another thing, you can use when you're thinking about plants for pollinators. They should have showy flowers, and they should produce rewards, including nectar, but there are other rewards that we'll talk about. All right, so I mentioned that pollination is part of the process through which plants reproduce sexually. Flowering plants reproduce sexually. And about 85% of those flowering plants rely on animals to be pollinated. The other 15% are wind pollinated. So this would include grasses. Grasses tend to be primarily wind pollinated, but they are in that big plant group. So about 85% of angiosperms need those animals. And again, pollinators help to maintain plant diversity, because without those pollinators, all of these angiosperms would not be able to reproduce, and we would have lower plant diversity and lower biodiversity in general. And another interesting sort of benefit of pollination is that when we get those seeds and fruits that result from pollination, those are a food source for birds and mammals. So there's really this cascading effect. When you have more pollination, not only do the plants reproduce, and not only do you have greater genetic diversity within the plants, but you also have a food source for birds and mammals, including humans. So many of the foods that we eat come from pollination or rely on pollination. And this study here estimated that about 87 of 115 crops grown globally are animal pollinated. So these are ones that rely on insects or other animal pollinators. And when we look at the acreage of crops grown worldwide, about 1/3 of global crop acreage is animal pollinated. So either way, if you look at it in terms of the number of crops or the percentage of crop production, our agriculture is really dependent on pollination, and specifically on animal pollination. When we talk about animal pollinators, we're not talking just about insects. There are a variety of animals that pollinate. Birds, for example, pollinate. Bats pollinate. Especially in places like Australia, where they have kind of a unique animal community. There are even mammals that pollinate. There's a little mammal called like the honey possum that pollinates. And so you have mammal pollination, bird pollination, but many pollinators, especially here in the United States, are insects. And these include beetles, butterflies, moths, wasps, bees, and flies. You all can spend a minute here looking at these pictures and see if you can identify the insects. And this is actually a fly that mimics a bee. We've got a true bee, an actual bee down here on the bottom, the bumblebee on the white flower. And then we have beetles next to that, another bee down at the bottom on the coreopsis, and then we've got a wasp on the tropical milkweed. All right, so we're going to focus on bees in particular today. I mentioned there are a lot of pollinators, but we're really going to focus on bees. And why is that? Well, first of all, bees, of those pollinators that I just mentioned, that I was just talking about, bees are the only ones that consume only pollen and nectar throughout their entire lifespan. All those other pollinators that I mentioned, flies, mammals, birds, bats, they may sip on nectar as a supplementary food source or a supplemental food source, or they might consume pollen and nectar during one stage of their life, but not the other. Bees, on the other hand, all they eat pollen and nectar as both larvae and adults. And so they're really dependent on those flowers. Bees can be social. These include honeybees, and they have queens and workers and large colonies, but they can also be solitary, meaning each individual female bee has her own little nest. She may only have about a dozen offspring. The social ones are the ones that we tend to use as domesticated or commercial pollinators because we can rear them in large colonies. But it's important to note that many bees don't have large colonies. They're solitary with just one female and maybe a dozen of her babies. Bees are central place foragers. They don't migrate. So for example, they're not like monarchs. They remain in one small area. The adults will create a nest and then they'll stay near that nest for their entire lifespan. And this can be good for pollination because they'll make repeated trips to the same flower patches. They'll forage in those patches throughout their entire lifespan. Bees provision their offspring with food, again, pollen and nectar, that's all they eat. So this differs from butterflies, right? When you think about a butterfly lays its eggs and then it abandons those eggs. Butterflies are not particularly great moms. Hopefully they select a nice spot to lay their eggs, but then their work is done. The caterpillars have to find their own food. Bee moms, on the other hand, they collect that pollen and nectar and they bring it back to their nest and they provide it for their offspring. So the offspring bees, the little baby bees, they don't do any of their own foraging until they become adults. They're fed by their mothers. And this is important because these moms have to collect pollen and nectar to bring back to the nest or the hive. They have pollen carrying hairs and other structures on their body to allow them to carry that pollen. And this in turn makes them good pollinators because they're actually trying to move that pollen around. Now, of course, they're not intentionally pollinating the plants. They're just trying to carry the pollen back to the nest. But by having these pollen carrying hairs and other features that allow them to carry pollen, they're good pollinators because the pollen is on their body as they move from flower to flower. So these are all ways in which bees are particularly good pollinators. Hopefully I've convinced you that they are, of the pollinators, they're arguably the most important globally. There are a lot of different types of bees, and this is important to understand because when we talk about plants for bees, it's important to note that there are a lot of different bees and they have different preferences, as we'll discuss. Honeybees are just one type of bee. In the United States, we just have a single species, Apis mellifera, and this is actually not native. It's been in the US for a few hundred years, but it's native to parts of Europe and Asia. So it's a single species. There are about a dozen, 10 or 12 species of honeybees worldwide, but in the US, we just have one species and it's not native. In contrast, in North America, there are about 5,000 species of other bees. We can call these native bees. They're native to the continent and they're wild. They're largely undomesticated. We don't rear them and carry them around in colonies. Of those 5,000 species, we know that of the ones assessed, about half are declining and 1 in 4 are imperiled. But we should note that we only have enough information to assess a fraction of those bees, 1,437 of 4,337. So most of the bees, we just don't really know how they're doing, most of the species. But of the ones that we do have information for, we know that some are declining and some are imperiled. About 1 in 4 are imperiled. Here in Florida specifically, there's over 300 species, and these are good pollinators for our wild plants, and many of them perform crop pollination as well, although I'll note that they don't provide honey. So for honey, we have to go to the honeybee. You can see below the ruler there some of our native wild species here in Florida. They range from the carpenter bee, which is the bee shown at number 10. That's the largest bee that we have here in Florida. Number 9 is a bumblebee, kind of the second largest. And then all the way down to some of our sweat bees, which are shown there at the 2, 1, and 0 mark. And those bees are not much larger than a large ant. So there's really a great diversity of size, shape, and color. All right, so I'm going to move on to talk about what bees need. I gave you a little bit of an introduction to the diversity of bees that we have here in Florida. At the end of this talk, I'll point you to some resources where you can learn more about bees. We certainly don't have time to go over 300 species of bees, so I'm really going to focus more on the gardening aspect. That's what this webinar is about. But if you want to learn more about these bees, I'll point you to some resources at the end. So what do bees need? Bees need pollen and nectar. I mentioned that's really all they consume. There's some minor exceptions to this. Some of the social bees, like honeybees, will occasionally get sugar from fruit. You might see a honeybee, sipping from an open peach or something like that. But for the most part, the majority of bees, all they consume is pollen and nectar. They also need nesting habitat, and this includes nesting habitat below and above ground. Some bees nest below ground, others nest above ground, and they need protection from toxins. So those are kind of the three main points. I'm going to focus mostly on this first one, but I will touch on the second and third towards the end. Okay, so to begin, what should you be thinking about when you select plants or flowers for bees as compared to other pollinators? A few things to keep in mind. Butterflies and hummingbirds are going to be visiting flowers just for nectar. This is for the most part. There are some that actually do consume pollen, but for the most part, they're visiting for nectar. Bees, on the other hand, are visiting for both pollen and nectar. Pollen is a really important protein source for the bees. Nectar is their sugar source. You might be wondering, well, where do butterflies and hummingbirds get that pollen source? Keep in mind that butterflies and hummingbirds are not just consuming floral resources. Butterflies, for example, in the caterpillar stage, they're eating leaves and other parts of the plant. Birds may be eating, when they're in the baby bird stage, they may be eating insects for protein. So butterflies and birds eat other things, whether that's insects or leaves. Bees are just eating pollen and nectar during their entire lifespan. So for bees, you want to make sure that the plants that you're selecting are not just good nectar plants, but are good pollen plants as well. You might find that you select some plants that you think these aren't really good nectar sources, but yet they're really attractive. Why are they so attractive? Well, it may be because they're a really good pollen source for those bees. Also keep in mind that butterflies and hummingbirds have longer mouth parts, a sort of a longer tongue, while bees in comparison have a shorter tongue. And this is going to influence which flowers they can access or feed from. And then finally, butterflies and hummingbirds see the red part of the spectrum, the color spectrum, meaning it's a bright, colorful, attractive color to them. Bees do not see red. It just sort of appears as gray. It's not a colorful or attractive color. And so this will influence which plants are attractive to bees compared to butterflies and hummingbirds. It is important to point out that there are some red flowers that are attractive to bees. This may be due to the shade of red, orange, pink. Also, there is a part of the spectrum that bees see, the ultraviolet part, that we don't see. And so some of these red, pink, orange flowers have an ultraviolet pattern that is really what's attracting the bee, and we can't see that pattern on top of the flower. So these are general guidelines, but there are always exceptions, and I'll point some of those out as we go along. So in summary, putting that all together, bee plants will tend to have flat, shallow, or medium length flower tubes. An example of a flat flower would be like a sunflower. An example of a medium length flower tube might be a salvia or a mountain mint. They also will generally prefer tubes that are wider. So again, like a salvia. And they generally are attracted to the colors yellow, white, or blue, purple. Another important point about bees is that they cannot hover like hummingbirds can. And so they need to be able to land on the flower, whether that's kind of a flat flower like a sunflower or a flower that has a lip that they can hang on to. You'll never see a bee hovering. Butterflies, they also need a landing pad. They can't hover, but they do see the red, orange, pink. So they'll be attracted to variable colors, but including the red, orange, pink. And they also have longer tongues or a longer proboscis. And so they'll be attracted to flowers that have a longer tube. Hummingbirds, finally, will also be attracted to longer tubes. also attracted to that red, orange, pink, just like butterflies. But something that's unique about them is that they do hover. So they don't need a landing pad. And also because they have large nectar needs, they're often found disproportionately on really large flowers, as opposed to butterflies and bees, which might be found on smaller flowers. I'm going to talk a little bit about general planting tips before I get into some specific plants that you can select for bees. So a couple of general tips to start. First of all, plant in clumps to have a high floral density. So research has found that bees in particular really like to forage in smaller areas with a high flower density. So if you have a large yard or you're restoring some kind of habitat, it's better to concentrate those floral resources in a small space. You also want to have a diversity of blooming plants throughout the year. So bees will forage at different times of the year. The social bees, like honeybees and bumblebees, they'll forage throughout most of the year because they have these large colonies that are active throughout most of the year. Other bee species, including all the bee species that are solitary, their life cycle, they'll have a phase where the adults are out foraging for nectar and pollen. And this phase could be quite short. It might only be 4 weeks out of the year. It might be 8 weeks out of the year. Some bees have that foraging phase in the spring, some in the summer, some in the fall. And if you're in South Florida, perhaps in the winter as well. And so different bees are going to be active at different times during the year. And because of this, you're going to need plants that bloom at different times throughout the year and throughout the year. A general rule is to have 3 different plants blooming at any given time and have at least a dozen flowering attractive plants in your garden. I'll sometimes get, related to this, I'll sometimes get a question, I saw these beautiful green metallic sweat bees foraging on my flowers, and now I don't see them anymore 3 weeks later. Did I kill them all? Or, I saw these lovely black and white striped bees. They were on my blanket flower. I saw them in May, it's August. Now I don't see them. What happened? Did I kill them? Did I use some kind of pesticide that killed them? Don't worry, probably not. Again, these bees that have these adult foraging periods of just 4 to maybe 8 weeks. The rest of the year, they are in that little larva or grub stage inside the nest. You're not going to be seeing them. So it doesn't mean that you've killed off the bees. It just means that that adult foraging phase where they're foraging on the flowers is over. Now it's time for the babies to grow within the nest, and then they'll emerge as adults the following spring or fall. So because you want resources throughout the year, it's important to think about what plants bloom early and what plants bloom late. In general, woody plants like trees and shrubs are great early blooming resources. These can be blooming as early as February, March, and South Florida as early as December, January. You also want to think about late blooming plants, and many of our native herbaceous wildflowers bloom late in the year, September, October, November, even as late as December. So mixing and matching woody plants and herbaceous plants can help you to get those resources throughout the entire year. Another thing to consider is having native plants, although you don't need to necessarily have exclusively native plants. So native plants are going to be a good pollen source. Pollen is what the bees specialize on. And there are many bees that are specialist bees that need pollen from a particular plant. So they might be specialized on, say, Asteraceae plants, which include sunflower, blanket flower, coreopsis. Alternatively, they might be more specialized on the mint family plants, which can include things like salvia or mountain mint. And when they are specialist or when they're specializing, it's really the pollen that they're specializing on. And so non-native plants, while they may not be as good of a pollen source, they can provide valuable nectar. Bees are less picky when it comes to nectar. And they can also be good resources for what we call generalist bees, bees that can consume resources from a variety of flowers. Honeybees are an example of a generalist, and so honeybees can use non-native plants, but many of our native wild bees need native plants. So mixing and matching native and non-native plants is generally the way to go, so that you can really provide resources for those native specialist bees, but also selecting non-native plants that are good nectar sources can be beneficial as well. To summarize some of these tips, again, yellow, white, blue, purple are going to be the colors most attractive to bees. Again, there are some exceptions here, but when we think about many of our native wild bees, these are the colors that are most attractive to them. Red, orange, pink will be more attractive to butterflies and hummingbirds. Honeybees as well will tend to visit red, orange, pink more than many of our native wild bees. Relatively shorter flower tubes like a salvia or a flat flower like a sunflower will be better for bees, while long and narrow flower tubes will be better for hummingbirds and butterflies. When you're looking at the flower shape, one thing that I want to point out is that it's important to look at that flower tube from the side. So that first picture there, where we see the butterfly foraging, we see the side of the flower, right? And you can sort of see that that's a medium and narrow flower tube. For a plant like, say, viburnum or a holly, when you look at the flower, you're sort of looking from a bird's eye view, you're looking at the top of the flower. And it may not appear that there's a flower tube, it may look flat, but if you look from the side, you'll notice a narrow but short flower tube on those flowers, including things like viburnum and hollies. And so it's important to kind of look at the side of the flower when you're thinking about the flower shape and how narrow or wide the flower tube is, or how long or short the flower tube is. Another example of a flower that might not look like it has a tube, it might look flat, would be lantana. If you look at lantana from the top, from a bird's eye view, it sort of looks, flattish like a sunflower. But if you look from the side, you'll notice that it does have a very narrow flower tube that's sort of in the short to medium length range. And then finally, as I mentioned, bees need pollen. So you want to avoid pollenless plants. You want to make sure that you're providing pollen as well as nectar. This isn't necessarily a big problem. Most of the plants that you're buying will probably produce some pollen, but there are pollenless sunflowers. There's pollenless lilies. There's pollenless bidens. There's a bidens, a commercial bidens that's pollenless. So when you're selecting plants for bees, make sure you're selecting ones that produce pollen. Okay, and I mentioned that plant preferences or flower preferences vary across pollinators and bees. So I'm just going to show you a couple results from my lab. We're not going to get too deep into this, but just to point out that these bees and pollinators more broadly do have different preferences. And so here what you're looking at is the relative visits to non-native plants, which is in blue, or native, which is in pink. So let's take this first group here on the left, the bumblebees. They actually make more visits to non-native plants than native in the studies that we've done. That's because bumblebees are generalists. They can visit a variety of plants and take advantage of non-native plants. If you look at the fourth bar, that's honeybees, you'll find the same pattern for honeybees. Honeybees actually make more visits to non-native than native, at least of the plants we've studied. Honeybees are, again, generalists. They can take advantage of a wide variety of plants. But when we look at other bees, which is further down the graph, we find that the other bees primarily visit native plants over non-native. And these other bees include sweat bees, longhorned bees. They can include a variety of solitary bees. Some are social, but in general, there's a lot of specialist bees in that group. And so they're going to be preferring native over non-native. So just keep in mind that bee preferences do differ. There are some bees that will visit non-native plants, but a lot of these 300 species we have here in Florida do rely on native plants. Additionally, we found when we look here at preferences across a variety of plants, many of these are ones that you all mentioned in the chat. We have firebush, we have powder puff or mimosa, we have honeysuckle on here, we have sunflowers, salvias. So when we looked at all of these different plants, you'll notice some received no bee visits at all. For example, paper flower, no bee visits, petunia, few to no bee visits. The plant that was most attractive to honeybees in the sort of orangish brown color was basil, in particular African blue basil. The plant that was most attractive to our other bees in the bright blue teal was beech sunflower. And the plant that was most attractive to bumblebees in purple was salvia, in particular Wendy's wish salvia, but many of the salvias are quite attractive. And so again, I'm just pointing out here that preferences differ across bees. What honeybees like, not necessarily the same as what many of our other bees or bumblebees like. And there are a variety of flowering plants that are just not attractive at all, including paper flower, roses. Many roses are not very attractive to bees. So just keep that in mind as well. Society garlic, not very attractive. And then finally, some bees can visit plants with long, narrow flower tubes because they will do what we call nectar rob. They'll sit on the side of the tube and they'll poke their little tongue in and they'll get the nectar that's at the base of that flower tube. And the bees that can do this include honeybees, bumblebees, and carpenter bees. But it's important to note that this is only 8 of the 325 species we have here in Florida. So most bees don't do this, but about 8 or so species do. And that's why you'll see sometimes these bees kind of sitting on these long, narrow flower tubes. They're getting the nectar without reaching all the way into the tube. Many of the plants that I'm going to recommend here in the final minutes of the talk can grow in small spaces. And so think about container gardening. The nice thing about a lot of these bee plants is that they are good for container or balcony gardening. This is a sample plan from a publication that I'll point out at the end of the talk here. This is an EDIS publication that was put out by me and some of my colleagues in IFAS Extension, as well as in horticulture. And here we just show that, again, you want to have different colors: white, purple, yellow, and some pink, red, orange for butterflies and hummingbirds. And you want to kind of cluster those. So having flower clusters or color clusters is a good idea to make it maximally attractive. Many of these can be grown in pots and balconies, and we offer some examples of plants inside the bubbles, specific plants. And I'll talk about those specific plants here in a minute. Okay, so what are some of the specific plants that I would recommend? This is the list that we found that's most attractive or visited by bees in native natural habitats. Many of these are not commercially available. I bring them up or I point them out because some of them are, especially if you go to a native plant nursery, but I will talk about ones that are more commercially available next. So included in this list is Liatris or blazing star. That's the plant in the top left. Dahlia pinnata or summer farewell, which is the plant shown in the top right, the white flowers. And then we have asters. Pedipsis graminifolia is silver-leaved aster. Vaccinium are wild blueberries. Calicarpa americana is American beautyberry. And then the third to last there, Chamaecrista fasciculata, is partridge pea. That's the bottom right photo, the big yellow flower. And then rubus are sort of wild blackberries or raspberries, the white flower in the bottom middle. So of these plants, I found Liatris available in native plant nurseries, as well as Pedipsis graminifolia, Vaccinium, and partridge pea or Chamaecrista fasciculata. So those I have found available, and some of those I have in my own yard. Ones that you might find more readily available in either a native plant nursery or even a sort of big box store that we found are most preferred or visited by bees include blanket flower or gaillardia, salvia, sunflower, including beech sunflower, snow square stem, which is also called salt and pepper, false rosemary, conradina. The edible rosemary is also quite attractive if you just plant edible rosemary, mimosa or powder puff, and then Spanish needle, which grows in developed landscapes, but probably not intentionally planted. That's the flower in the top right. It's more of a weedy plant. And then there are others too that I'll talk about next that we recommend, but this includes the ones that we found that are most attractive. I don't have firebush on here because it's attractive only to kind of a small subset of the bees, including the honeybees and bumblebees, but it is very attractive to honeybees and bumblebees, and was one that I believe was mentioned quite frequently in the chat. So I'll add firebush as well as dwarf firebush to this list here. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of run through some of these plants quite quickly, and then I'll point you to some resources where you can learn more. Sparkleberry is related to the edible or the cultivated blueberry. It's a vaccinium and is a nice one for bumblebees. It's a nice early spring plant. Oh, and I should mention too that the first plants I'll mention are woody plants. So these are typically early blooming plants. They take up more space. And then I'll talk about herbaceous plants that tend to bloom later in the year and take up less space. Chaste tree is another nice one that's a little more appropriate for South Florida, throughout Florida. It's actually not native, but it's a good one for the bumblebees that can take advantage of non-native plants and blooms more like spring, summer. So not quite as early as some of these other woody plants. Eastern redbud is an early blooming one, more appropriate for North Florida, very early blooming and very attractive to bumblebees. Senna is nice, especially for Central and South Florida, and grows sort of sporadically or blooms sporadically throughout the year. You can get both Chapman's and privet senna, and will be attractive to bumblebees, but also sweat bees and other bees. There's a little sweat bee there. And so those are senna, eastern redbud, chaste tree, and sparkleberry are just some of the woody plants. There are many others that I don't have on this list, but are on other lists that I'll point you to, including things like fringe tree, jacaranda. There are a number of other trees. So again, these tend to be earlier blooming, although some will bloom year round into the summer. And they tend to take up a little more space and they're woody perennials. You'll notice they have a variety of colors: yellow, sort of a pinkish purple, purple, and white. So those are the colors you want to focus on. In the herbaceous category, we have sunflower. Beach sunflower in particular is a great one for most of Florida and is really attractive to a lot of our native wild bees, including specialists. Blanket flower is one of the most attractive. There's one that is now it's no longer considered native, but naturalized, Gaillardia pulchella. And then there are other non-native, more domesticated species and varieties available as well. These have a spring through fall bloom period. They'll bloom kind of sporadically over a longer period of time and are really attractive to a lot of our specialist native wild bees. Mints, including spotted bee balm or dotted horse mint. We could also add mountain mint to this group. Someone in the chat mentioned mountain mint. These are great plants that, again, bloom for a relatively long period, kind of in the summer, fall, and are really attractive to bumblebees, but will also attract other bees, including sweat bees. Salvia is one of the most attractive plants to bumblebees in particular, and you can get salvia in a variety of colors. Some of the ones we found that are most attractive include Rock and Play in the Blues and Mystic Spires Blues. These cultivars produce the sort of purple blue flowers and are really highly attractive to bumblebees. So if you're going to plant just a couple plants, I would focus on salvia and blanket flower. These are usually well grown throughout Florida, readily available, attractive to a variety of bees, and also different bees. You'll get more of the sweat bees and specialist bees on blanket flower and bumblebees on salvia. So those two are sort of my top two of all of these plants, but these plants are great to grow in combination if you can grow more than just a few. False rosemary or scrub mint, again, is very attractive to bumblebees. It does tend to be a little particular in terms of where it grows. But if you can get it to grow well in your yard, this is actually a picture of it in my yard, it will produce a really large floral display that's super attractive to bumblebees. There's a picture of a bumblebee visiting in my yard. And I recommend the grandiflora. That's the species that produces the larger flowers, although there are other species as well. And we have this plant also growing right next to the honeybee lab here on campus. Partridge pea is a nice one for later in the year, more like summer, fall. It's actually blooming right now on campus in our natural area. Really attractive to bumblebees, but will also attract sweat bees and other bees as well. And produces a yellow flower, which is nice to use in combination with some of these other plants I've recommended. If we scroll back, you'll notice they have purple flowers, the salvias, the false rosemaries. So again, thinking about combining those colors, having purple, but also yellow, like in the case of partridge bee. Snow square stem salt and pepper. I was glad to see someone mention this in the chat. It does tend to take up a little bit more space and kind of has sort of a wild growth form, but it's really attractive to bees, and it will also attract a lot of small butterflies. And it blooms throughout kind of the summer fall period. And so that's a great one for bees as well as some butterflies. And then finally, if you want something that's more of a ground cover, powder puff or sunshine mimosa is great for a variety of bees. We can see a longhorned bee. This is one of our native specialist bees on mimosa, and that was taken here on campus. And then a non-native plant that's particularly good for honeybees. Honestly, it's not visited by a whole lot other than honeybees, but the honeybees love it, is African blue basil. We do sometimes see bumblebees on it as well. So this is not native, but it's a great nectar source for honeybees. So if you have honeybees around or you want to provide nectar specifically for honeybees, this is a good one. And then I'll just point out that there are weeds that are particularly attractive: Spanish needle, thistles, spiderwort, which is the bottom right, and then goldenrod, which is the bottom left. Spanish needle is the top right, and there's a picture of a thistle in the top left. So these are great if you have areas of your yard where, maybe you don't care if you have some weeds and they're not taking over your yard or your area. These are ones that are particularly attractive. And then finally, I'm going to end with just some other ways to help and some additional resources. And so you do want to, if you're growing plants for bees, you do want to minimize pesticide use on those plants. Keep in mind that this does include fungicides, not just insecticides. So I would say just try to avoid using chemicals, fungicides, and insecticides on these flowering plants when they're flowering. If you apply the chemical to the plant outside of the flowering period, it's much less likely to affect the pollinators, especially if you're using something that has a short period of activity. So a lot of the organic insecticides and fungicides have a very short period of activity. So you can apply when the plant isn't flowering, and by the time the plant does flower, it's no longer going to be an issue. And there are conventional or non-organic ones that also have a short period of activity. So what you want to do is avoid using it when the plant's flowering, and also avoid ones that are systemic, which means that they last for a long time, they remain on or within the plant. In terms of nesting resources, keep in mind that most bees do nest below ground. And so really all they require is just some undisturbed soil that doesn't have a really heavy mulch. They can nest within some degree of mulch, whether it's straw or wood chip or grass. But if you have like a cloth barrier or a plastic barrier, something that's really impenetrable, they won't be able to nest beneath that. Some do nest above ground. And so for those bees, you can put up these little bee houses. And what we recommend for those are to pick ones that have small and long cavities. The cavities should be at most 12 millimeter diameter. So ranging from 2, 3, 4 to 12 millimeters, and at least 150 millimeters or 6 inches long. So you want to go for narrow and long. You'll see bee houses in stores that have like these huge holes. Bees are not going to want to nest in there. You want to go for small and long. And you can find ones that have replaceable liners, or you can buy these liners and put them inside the tubes and replace them. There are also neat ones like the one shown on the right here that have these trays that you can pull out and clean. Or alternatively, you can just drill holes, again, that are long and narrow. You can drill those holes in wood blocks, set those wood blocks out, maybe in a nice little design like the one shown in the bottom left, and then just replace those wood blocks every 3-4 years. And this is to prevent diseases and parasites from building up within the nests. So in general, it's a good idea to have cavities that can be cleaned either by just replacing those wood blocks, having trays that you can pull out and clean, or replaceable liners. All right, so I'm going to end by just pointing you to some resources, and then we'll have time for questions. This is my lab's website where you can find resources, including the IFAS publication that had that sample design or layout. We also have a newly developed mobile app to select plants for bees, Bee Gardens mobile app, and that's the web page there that was developed in collaboration with folks in environmental horticulture and the Florida Friendly Landscaping team. And then finally, you can get more information if you take an online course that we have available, Gardening for Pollinators. And if you go to the website listed here, Gardening for Pollinators Fall 2022, this is a UF IFAS online course. Registration will be open September 1st. So if you click on this link now, you'll see it'll say registration isn't open. That's because it opens September 1st. So if you visit that site on or after September 1st, you can enroll in the course. It will go on throughout the fall semester, and it's fully online. So it's just at your own pace, fully online. And with that, I would be happy to answer questions in the chat. And yeah, hopefully you learned quite a bit about gardening for bees, and you can find out more at these resources.
Rachel, that was a great presentation. Thank you so much. And I'm going to go ahead and go through some of the questions here. And the first one that I see is, are the other honeybees that you mentioned, and this is towards the beginning of the presentation, are the other honeybees that you mentioned the stingless bees in Central America?
Yeah, great question. No, so the other honeybees I mentioned are in the Apis genus. So the one we have here in the US is Apis mellifera. There are other honeybees. Apis cerana is another species that's been domesticated and is used in Asia for pollination. So when I mentioned the 10 or 12 species of honeybees, kind of depending on how you split or lump them, those are all Apis, and those are distributed throughout the world, but none of them are here in the Americas. In the Americas, we don't have any honeybees, so we don't have any Apis. But we do in Central and South America have these stingless bees. They are also social, so they have these large colonies, but they don't sting, so they're different from honeybees in that regard. And they have been used for pollination. They're what I would call semi-domesticated. So honeybees, we've like fully domesticated them. You know, we breed them. We know tons about what homes to put them in and drive them around the country. The stingless bees have been kind of semi-domesticated and used for crop pollination, but they're only found in like Central and South America, not here in North America.
Okay, great. Someone else also asked, don't the bees need a water source?
Good question. Yeah, so that typically refers to honeybees, and they do need a water source. Most of the other bees, again, because they're solitary, they don't have these large colonies. They're not producing honey. They need water, but in amounts that can generally just be found in nature. So for the non-honeybees, you know, all those 300-ish species that we have here in Florida, you don't need to intentionally provide water for them. They'll find it. It's fine. For honeybees, if you're a beekeeper and you have a lot of honeybees, then you may want to think about providing like a shallow water source for them.
Super. That's great. Next question is pollen always dry and nectar wet?
Yeah, good question. So nectar is wet. Yep. It's like a liquid. Pollen is generally dry. Yep. And so there are kind of two ways that bees will carry the nectar and pollen. Honeybees and bumblebees pack the two together and carry it on their legs in what looks like a wet ball. So if you see a honeybee or a bumblebee, it'll have like this kind of wet, sticky, glistening ball on the leg. That's pollen and nectar mixed together. Other bees will carry the pollen loose on the leg or on the abdomen, meaning they don't mix it with nectar. And so in that case, it will look really dry because it's not mixed with nectar. And then they carry the nectar internally and regurgitate it when they get back to the nest. And I'll just kind of go back here quickly to a picture. This is a picture of a bee that's carrying that pollen loose and dry on its legs. If there was a way I could blow it up here, I would easily, but I'm not sure that I can. You can sort of see that it's loose and dry on the leg. It's not like a little wet packed ball. I think there was a picture. Here we go. Here's a picture of a wet packed ball on the bumblebee.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. Now, the next question, Rachel, I don't know if this is just a word I'm unfamiliar with or if it's like an autocorrect, but it says once an anther, ANTHUR, has been visited and voided of its pollen,
Yep.
Can it create more, or does each anther only pollinate once?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right. So pollen is not a renewable resource like nectar. So essentially, once the bee has taken the pollen from the anther, or maybe wind has taken it away, it's gone. The plant's not going to keep producing more. And that's in contrast to nectar, which the plant does just kind of keep producing while the flower is blooming or while the plant's blooming. So that's a really interesting difference between nectar and pollen. I don't know if that is what the person was getting at with that question, but it is an interesting difference. So yes, an anther has a certain amount of pollen at the beginning of bloom. And once that pollen has been taken by a bee or wind, it's gone. It's not going to keep producing pollen. But nectar does replenish over the lifespan of the flower.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to go on to some of the questions from the Q&A. And one of the ones is native lantana or invasive lantana for bees. I think I know the answer to that one.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, in general, I wouldn't recommend planting the invasive lantana. We do find, so we included the native non-invasive lantana in our study, and then we also included the non-native sterile non-invasive lantana. And both of those were highly attractive to butterflies and also to a lesser extent to honeybees. So butterflies were the group that most visited lantana, and then we did find honeybees visiting them as well. It's not very attractive to other bees because again, when you look at the flower, you'll actually notice it does have a very narrow and long flower tube. Honeybees have a longer tongue than many other bees. So that's why they can use lantana, other bees can't. So in some, native lantana, and then the sterile, non-native commercial could be good for butterflies and honeybees. But yeah, don't plant the invasive one.
Okay, and kind of a related question, I'm going back and forth now here a little bit, but can specialist bees distinguish between native and non-native plants? Will they go collect pollen from a non-native plant that is closely related to a native plant in the same genus family?
Yeah, that's a great question.
It is.
So in general, bees use a variety of cues to select their plants. And so they will use scent as well as color and shape. And so what we found is that we do see more specialist bee visits on native plants compared to non-native, even when you're comparing kind of closely related plants. And probably it's the scent bouquet, as well as maybe other aspects of flower and color. But I would say most likely it's the scent bouquet that's really driving them to choose one plant over another. And then once they visit a plant and kind of realize, hey, this is a plant that I like, it has a lot of nectar, it has a lot of pollen, then they'll repeatedly visit that plant over and over again. But I will say that there aren't a lot of studies that have looked at really closely related native and non-native. And so that's still kind of a question that we're trying to answer. But from the little that has been done, it does seem that native specialist bees will prefer native even over a closely related non-native. And they're probably using aspects of the scent bouquet as well as color and shape.
Fascinating. This is a question in the chat, which I just loved and I wanted to read out loud. It's how many attendees are beekeepers? I started about a year ago and have 3 hives.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Let's see. Well, What one person writes, can we assume you've had your fair share of stings over the years?
Yeah, I actually, I was trying to think of the last time that I've been stung by a honeybee. I guess doing blueberry pollination work. We do work on crop pollination, as Claire mentioned in the introduction. And I have been stung by honeybees on blueberry farms doing crop pollination work. And then I've also been stung by bumblebees. But usually I think all of the bumblebee stings have been working with, you can actually buy colonies of bumblebees and use them in pollination in greenhouses or fields. And so I've only ever been stung by bumblebees when I'm working with the box with the colony. And those are the only bees that I've been repeatedly stung by, honeybees and bumblebees. Most of the other bees, most of those 300 species are really gentle and won't sting unless you're putting your hand on them or your foot on them. So the only time I can remember getting stung by something that wasn't a bumblebee or a honeybee was a sweat bee, and I was biking and pretty sweaty, and it somehow got like on the underside of my knee, and as I was biking and kind of closing my leg, it was stinging me. And some of these bees can sting repeatedly, unlike honeybees. So it stung me a few times before I got it to go away. But yeah, that's the only time I've been stung by anything other than a bumblebee and a honeybee.
Well, good. I'm glad. I hope that hasn't happened all that
Yeah,
often.
so then that's all to say that most bees, other than honeybees and bumblebees, are really non-aggressive. And even honeybees and bumblebees, if you're near the hive or the colony, they'll display aggressive behaviors. But if they're just foraging on flowers, like they're tuned into the nectar and pollen, they're just ignoring you.
Awesome. So this question has come up a couple times, and I know you went through a lot of plants. It says, please discuss potted plants for bees, in 4 or 5 pots, or just, if you don't have much space.
Right. Yeah. So we actually are doing a study right now where we're enhancing gardeners' lawns with pollinator plants, only using potted plants. And so I'm a little better able to address this question because we've been looking at just this. So we have been using I think 2-gallon pots, so pretty big pots. So 2-gallon pots, and we've found that the salvia grows really well in these 2-gallon pots. Also beach sunflower and bee balm have grown really well. And so those were all mentioned, beach sunflower, bee balm or dotted horseman, and salvia. And then the conradina, the false rosemary here, has done pretty well as well in the potted plant. So those 4 have done pretty well. We have not had much luck with the blanket flower, interestingly. I'm not sure why that's the case. We're going to try again with a different source from a nursery. But I can say that I would definitely recommend salvia, beach sunflower, and then maybe, especially if you're not in South Florida, the bee balm and the conradina as well.
Wonderful. Another question, and we're wrapping up here, and we've just got a couple minutes left. But another question is, what is the best time of year to set up a bee house, and the best time to clean it?
Yeah. So I would set it out if you're in North or Central Florida, set it out like in January. In South Florida, that's probably as good a time as any as well, because most of the bees that would utilize that are going to be either spring or fall nesting. So kind of put it out at the beginning of the year in January. And then if you do clean it, I wouldn't clean it every year. I would just clean it like every 3 years. And I'd probably aim for summer because that's kind of in between. If it's a spring bee using it or a fall bee using it, it's kind of in between when the bees might actually be actively nesting in there. But there's no real ideal time to clean because it's hard to know what bee exactly is nesting in there. And so I would recommend only cleaning it every few years. Don't do it every year.
Wonderful. Okay. Another one is, and one announcement I want to make for people who've written this in there, we do record these webinars, and it'll be up on our website in about 2 weeks. So should you want to revisit and catch back up on things, just visit our website and you can watch this video again. What are European honeybees competing with native bees, pollen or nectar?
Yeah, good question. Both in general. European honeybees collect pollen and nectar from plants. And what we found is that they compete most with bees that like similar plants. And so they're competing mostly with bumblebees because bumblebees and honeybees kind of share a lot of the same preferences. Other bees that will visit, things that honeybees don't like, there's less competition between them. So it's really the bumblebees that, we kind of worry about competition. And it's both pollen and nectar that they're competing for.
Well, wonderful, Rachel. Thank you, Dr. Mallinger, so much for taking us through this. And I know I've learned a lot. So I've really enjoyed today's presentation. And
Great. Well, thank you. Yeah. And feel free to email me too. If you have questions, you can find my email on the lab website.
wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.